Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche organization with your daily video update for May 12th, 2023. It's Friday, so I'm going to take your questions, and in fact, I'm going to be putting a bunch of questions together into one question and answer, because many of you have written to me over time saying, why do you keep emphasizing the role of the British? Isn't it the Americans who are behind the war? Isn't it the Americans who run the world empire? The British Empire collapsed at the end of World War II. The economy has collapsed. The military has collapsed. How can you keep emphasizing the role of the British? And what I want to address then is what it is that people either don't understand or have never learned, which is the difference between a republic and an empire, and the misunderstanding of what an empire is. In the old days, the empire was based on physical force. The British Navy was the strongest in the world. The Roman legions were the most powerful military in their day. But what we have now is a situation where you've seen a collapse of certain elements of the British power. But what is the basis of their power? It's centered in the City of London, in the British so-called educational institutes, especially Oxford and Cambridge, and the British think tanks. And I include in those British think tanks American institutions such as the Council on Foreign Relations, Atlantic Council, which is an Anglo-American one. Chatham House, of course, is at the center of this. But the question then is, what is the alternative to an empire? And do we have that alternative in the world today? Now, it was Louis XI in the middle of the 15th century in France who developed what became known as the nation state, in which it was clear that the purpose of government was to serve the common interest of the people, not the special aristocratic privilege that dominates what an empire is. And this was not perfectly developed under Louis XI. It was advanced further under Henry VII and the Tudor Renaissance in England. And the fight in these periods was between aristocratic privilege and private interest on the one side, and an approach to improving the conditions for the general population on the other. The question then is, who rules? Who makes the policies? Now, I would say it's clear that republics today have fallen under the sway of the power of money. And money, through its control of ideas and the narratives, have made the people blind to the fact that we no longer have a functioning republic. But if you look at the founding of the United States, it was a very different system then than we have today. Because Franklin and the founding fathers, and I'm talking about Benjamin Franklin and people like Washington and Alexander Hamilton, rejected the British idea of government, rejected the idea of an aristocratic government, typified by the writings of the so-called philosophers Hobbes and Locke. Now, Hobbes is typical of the old form of empire, which essentially starts from the standpoint that since all people are evil and will seek their own interests, you need a power over the top to keep the competing interests under control. It's okay to let them fight each other, but the policy has to come from that power at the top. Now, Locke essentially had the same idea. He also thought that people were driven by greed and selfishness. But what he argued is for a softer idea, namely a contract. So you'd have a contract in which the competing interests would accept certain aspects of the other interests, but nevertheless, it was still based on a negative conception of man and the need for an aristocratic power over and above, operating through contract law. And with Locke, you had the idea of life, liberty, and pursuit of property, or life, liberty, and property. Now, this was rejected by Franklin and the American revolutionists. They adopted instead life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, which was a Leibnizian concept coming from the German philosopher Leibniz. The idea is that you have a government which acts in the interests of all people so that everyone can contribute happily to the improvements for everyone. And Leibniz was extremely active, not just in Germany, but in England, had networks in China, networks all over the world that were trying to, and including in Russia, through a relationship with Peter the Great. The idea being that happiness comes from knowing you have a mission in life that is oriented toward a better future for all. Now, in U.S. history, we've always had a fight between this concept of a republic under a constitution, where you act for the benefit of all, versus an empire. And the British never gave up in their intention to subordinate the United States to the British Empire. And when they could no longer do that, they intended to control the thinking of American leaders through the educational institutes and think tanks and so on, but also through the power of the financial control of the City of London, so that their interests would still be able to be represented and, in fact, dominate what became the empire that LaRouche always called British brains and American brawn. Now, I want to just amplify this using the words of Friedrich Schiller, who said there's no contradiction between patriotism and love of mankind. One can be both a patriot and a world citizen. And that's the conception that Schiller drew from looking at the American Revolution as a contemporary. And that's the idea that we should have today, not just for the United States and Western Europe, but for the whole world. That our interests are coherent with the interests of every single person on the planet. We may have very different backgrounds and cultures, but we're still human beings. And that's what the American Republic was created to provide as a model for the world. How far have we gone from that? And that's the effect of the British philosophical radicalism, neoliberalism, and the idea of the beast man, which goes back to Hobbes's Leviathan. So let's jump to the present. What's the war in Ukraine about? It's a defense of an empire, a so-called global rules-based order controlled by interconnected corporate cartels that represent, in a sense, aristocratic interests for small handfuls of people over and above the general population. Now, the World Economic Forum, which many people cite as the leading enemy, this is just the latest of these kinds of institutions. Before this, we had the Trilateral Commission, but before that, you go back to the 19th century, early 20th century, and what did you have? You had the British Fabian Society, you had H.G. Wells, you had Bertrand Russell. These were all proponents of a British imperial system that would take the form of geopolitics. That is, you divide the world up into competing interests, and you have over the top the power of the empire. And the empire is no longer simply force, but the empire of the mind. And this is where so-called hybrid warfare comes in. Who controls the narrative? And not only the so-called narrative, but who controls how people think? That's what this concept of pre-bunking is. If you control what people think are the alternatives, then you don't have to worry about what they choose. You pre-bunk rather than debunk. You limit the choices so that people have to choose between objectives which are determined not by the interests of the people, but by the interests of the aristocratic controllers. And the center of this today is the City of London, the British academic institutions, Oxford and Cambridge, the think tanks such as Chatham House, the Royal United Services Institute, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Atlantic Council, and so on. And the mythology is the idea that Churchill introduced of the special relationship of the English-speaking peoples, that we have a common purpose of an empire, but an empire that doesn't seem to be an empire anymore. And this is what LaRouche referred to as British brains and American brawn. Use force when necessary. That's what NATO is about. But what is the point of using force? To defend the rules-based order. So today, who controls the narrative? Well, democracy versus authoritarians. Where does that come from? It comes from the Atlantic Council, but it comes from the British networks in the permanent bureaucracy of the U.S. State Department and Justice Department, what might be called administrative fascism, which was the term LaRouche used for it. It's the idea of free trade and globalization against what they call narrow nationalism. That is, if you don't support free trade, if you don't oppose sovereign nations, you are some kind of a right-wing nationalist, probably Nazi extremist. You control the narrative that way so that the choices are limited. And that's limited to either supporting free trade or being some kind of troglodyte who has to be silenced and censored. So the rules-based order is centered around this idea that you must stick to the accepted rules, not international law, but the rules that defend the special private interests of the aristocratic institutions, of the international banks, of the international cartels. And if you don't, you will pay a price. That is why NATO exists. That is why the U.S. spends so much, nearly $1 trillion a year, on military power. And if you don't stick to the rules, what happens to you? Well, ask Saddam Hussein, ask Muammar Gaddafi, ask Yanukovych, a democratically elected leader in Ukraine who was ousted by a fascist coup run out of Washington and London. So today, who are the enemies of this globalist regime? Putin and Xi Jinping. Why? Because they don't want to surrender Russia and China, surrender the sovereignty to this global rules-based order. Instead, they're fighting for a world of nations that share common interests and mutually beneficial development. And so we have, coming from the empire, namely London, the initiatives to extend the war in Ukraine against Russia, to defeat Russia, to dismantle Russia, to loot Russia, and then use Taiwan to do the same thing to China. And so each step of the way in this war, the shots have been called by the British. When Zelensky was prepared to negotiate a ceasefire or a settlement, negotiations in March of 2022, Boris Johnson was sent in by NATO. After the Zelensky-Xi talk last month, Sir Richard Dearlove, the former head of British intelligence, MI6, was sent in to send the word to Zelensky, no negotiations. The military objectives are being defined by London. Crimea, this came out of the Royal United Services Institute and the discussion of a Crimean missile crisis. The British led the role in sending tanks and depleted uranium. Now they announced yesterday long-range missiles to enable Ukraine to not only take back Crimea, but to inflict damage inside Russia. And then you have the US, the UK, and the European Union working together to try and freeze out Chinese and Russian influence in the global south, where the Belt and Road Initiative is making headway in South America, in Asia, and in Africa. Doing what? Building bridges, building highways, building railroads, building power plants and water projects. And what is the EU-US policy? Coups. Defend the status quo. Keep the funds flowing to the International Monetary Fund and the raw materials flowing to the global cartels. That's the fight in the world today. And again, it's shaped by these interests centered in London. One other aspect of this, the use of global warming as a cover. It's a hoax, but it's a cover for depopulation. And where does this come from? Parson Malthus, the British economist and spokesman for the British East India Company, who promoted the idea of limited resources, and therefore you're going to constantly have a battle over these limited resources. And the powerful must maintain their control by reducing the population of the useless eaters. This is behind almost all of the environmentalist movement, though most of the brainwashed youth today who march with Fridays for Future and and the last generation and glue themselves to roads in Berlin to stop traffic. They don't know what the issue is. They don't understand the role of the British or Malthus, but that's what they have been brainwashed into doing. That's how soft power works. That's how hybrid warfare works. You convince people that they're doing something good as they're actually carrying out acts that will lead to the extinction of the human race. And it's an attack on one of the aspects of the American system, which is the idea of scientific and technological optimism, that you can solve problems through science and technology, as opposed to clinging to anti-scientific cults to end progress and to eliminate so-called excess population. So we see European Union nations are dying demographically. They're not producing children. We see the violence of the shootings in the schools in the United States, where young people have lost any hope and have been brainwashed to think they can go out in a blaze of glory and their friends can read about them on social media. So this is what the fight is about. This is the British system versus the American Republican tradition. I'm not arguing that the American Republican tradition is active today. It exists in the LaRouche movement and in those people who think like us. And we have to make this again the common thinking of Americans, that we use science and technology. We use a credit system to fund advances in physical economy, as opposed to make a few people rich. That's the difference between an aristocratic system of privilege, of the British system, which we just saw in vulgar display with the coronation of King Charles, with the benighted and bejeweled lords and ladies of London, and the rest of the world, some of the world anyway, watching in awe. That's the world of privilege. But the vast majority of people want decent lives and a meaning and a purpose in their existence. And that's what the fight has always been. So I hope this gets to the question of why do we say the British? Because it's a system. It's not the English people. The English people are a victim of this. Just look at the people who have to wait 20 hours for an ambulance, who can't get into a hospital. The doctors and nurses who are not getting paid in London and elsewhere in the United Kingdom. They're a victim of this system. And it's time that we replace this old, aging, dying imperial system with a system of sovereign nation states that act for the mutual benefit of all, which means economic development. Now, I had one other question that intrigued me that I just don't have the time for, but Todd asked me about the library you see behind me, if I could recommend some books that I think are influential and useful for people to read. And I promised to do that on some future Friday. But for today, I don't have the time. But I want you to think about this concept of a republic versus an empire. And to help you with that, I'm attaching a link to a speech given by Lyndon LaRouche in 2007, titled "Save the American Republic from the British Empire." I think you'll find some very compelling and provocative ideas in there, which you can use to get your friends up to snuff on what the real fight is today. It's a fight against administrative fascism based on the control or the enforcement of the right to special privilege to the rich and powerful against the vast majority of humanity. And we, Americans and decent citizens of Western Europe, have to stand forward for the better tradition that goes back to the fight for a republican conception of man and the image of that morality depends on fighting for a better future. So thanks for joining me. Do some thinking. I'll be back again next week. Hello, thanks for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our videos. Support our independence to produce videos like these. Become a member of the LaRouche organization at thelarouche.org/member. By becoming a member for $25 or more, you'll get special access to the EIR Alert Daily Briefing and Weekly Magazine, which is what I read to stay on top of things.